Julian Thorne liked to hear the sound of bones snapping. To him, it sounded like authority. When he swung that iron bar down on Silas's leg 3 years ago, he wasn't just punishing a laborer for looking him in the eye, he was marking him. He wanted everyone on the Thorne plantation to see what happened to a man who didn't know his place. He wanted a permanent reminder of his power hobbling across his fields every single day. Julian spent every Sunday afternoon sitting on his wide, shaded porch, sipping expensive bourbon and laughing as Silas struggled to carry heavy crates of grain from the barn to the wagons. He called Silas the pendulum because of the way the man's body swung violently to the left with every agonizing step. But Julian made the one mistake that men of his kind always make. He assumed that a man who walks with a limp also thinks with a limp. He assumed that because Silas was physically broken, his spirit had dried up like a dead cypress branch in the Louisiana heat. He couldn't have been more wrong. What Julian didn't know was that Silas was a man of long memories and quiet calculations. Silas wasn't just carrying a ruined leg under those thick, mud-caked bandages. He was carrying the end of the Thorne dynasty, tucked right against his skin. The air in the bayou is different on a Sunday. It's thick, heavy with the smell of rotten vegetation and the sweet, cloying scent of jasmine. It's the kind of heat that makes a man's clothes stick to his back like a second skin. On this particular Sunday, Julian Thorne was bored. Boredom in a man like Julian is a dangerous
thing. He looked at his prize hounds, 4 massive beasts with deep chests and eyes that reflected nothing but hunger. Then he looked at Silas, who was currently dragging a sack of flour toward the kitchen house. Silas's left leg trailed behind him, drawing a jagged line in the dust. Julian smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. It was the look of a predator finding a way to kill an afternoon. He called out to the stable boy, Toby, a kid no older than 12, who already had the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. Julian told the boy to fetch his boots and his rifle. He wasn't going after deer today. He wasn't going after wild hogs. He wanted to see how fast a man with one good leg could move when he had 400 pounds of muscle and teeth breathing down his neck. But to understand why Julian felt so untouchable, you have to understand what happened 6 months before the hunt began. A federal land surveyor had arrived at the plantation. He was a man from the city, dressed in stiff clothes and carrying a leather satchel full of maps and tools. He was there to verify the boundaries of the Thorne estate, investigating rumors that the family had been illegally expanding their borders into government-protected swamplands. The surveyor had a brass compass, a beautiful, heavy piece of equipment with the initials of the United States Land Office engraved on the lid. Julian had invited the man into his study, offered him a drink, and then, when the sun went down, he led him out into the woods. Silas had been the one told to bring the shovel. He had stood in the shadows of the tall pines and watched Julian Thorne drive a knife into the surveyor's chest. He watched Julian burn the maps and the deeds in a small, frantic fire. Julian thought he was being thorough. He thought he was wiping away the only evidence of his theft. But when Julian turned his back to spit into the dirt, Silas saw something glinting in the dying embers. It was the brass compass. The fire hadn't claimed it yet. While Julian was busy cleaning his blade, Silas reached into the heat. He didn't flinch as the metal scorched his palm. He tucked it into the deep folds of his leg wrappings, right against the bone Julian had shattered years before. From that night on, the limp became Silas's greatest weapon. He exaggerated the drag. He made sure Julian saw him stumble. He made sure Julian felt a sense of total mocking victory every time he looked at him. Now, on the day of the hunt, Julian stood on the edge of the lawn, holding the leashes of his dogs. Hattie, the plantation cook, stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. She had seen Julian cleaning blood off his saddle the night the surveyor disappeared. She knew the look in Julian's eyes. She caught Silas's gaze for a split second, a silent communication between two people who had survived by being invisible. She knew Silas was about to run, and she knew he wouldn't be coming back the same way. Julian checked his pocket watch, the gold casing clicking shut with a sound like a gunshot. He told Silas he had a 3-minute head start. If Silas could make it to the Black Slough, 3 miles deep into the cypress swamp, Julian would let him live another week. It was a lie, of course. Julian had no intention of letting Silas reach the slough. He just wanted to watch the pendulum swing one last time before the dogs tore him apart. He fired a shot into the air, the crack echoing off the moss-drenched trees, and shouted for Silas to move. Silas didn't hesitate. He turned and began his awkward, lurching run toward the tree line. To Julian, it looked pathetic. Silas's shoulders leaned hard to the right, his left foot dragging through the dirt, kicking up small clouds of dust. Julian laughed, a loud, jagged sound that cut through the humidity. He leaned against a fence post and lit a cigar, watching the man he thought he had broken vanish into the green wall of the swamp. What Julian couldn't see from the porch was the change in Silas's eyes the moment he stepped under the canopy of the trees. The moment the leaves blocked the view of the big house, the pendulum stopped swinging. Silas didn't stop limping, not yet, but the rhythm of his movement changed. It became purposeful. Every time his foot hit the ground, he was measuring the distance. He knew every root, every sinkhole, and every patch of soft mud in that swamp. He had spent years mapping it in his head, while Julian was busy drinking away his father's fortune. The 3 minutes felt like an eternity to those watching from the quarters, but to Silas it was a precision window. He didn't head for the dry paths. He headed straight for the places where the ground looked solid but acted like water. He was leaving a trail, but it wasn't the trail of a panicked man. It was a lure. He made sure to drag his foot extra deep in the soft silt near the creek beds. He wanted the dogs to have an easy scent. He wanted Julian to follow the path of least resistance right into the heart of the mire. Behind him he heard the first bell-like baying of the lead hound. The hunt was officially on. The sound was terrifying, a deep, resonant howl that signaled the dogs had picked up the scent of fear. But Silas wasn't afraid. He felt the weight of the brass compass against his shin, a cold, hard reminder of the truth. He knew that Julian Thorne wasn't just chasing a laborer, he was chasing his own ghost. As Silas pushed deeper into the swamp, the water began to rise around his ankles. The smell of sulfur and old decay filled his lungs. This was the Black Slough, a place where the sun rarely touched the ground. The trees grew close together, their knees poking up from the water like the teeth of some prehistoric beast. Silas stopped for a moment, listening. He could hear the crashing of the hounds through the brush, and further back the sound of Julian's horse struggling in the thickening mud. Julian was shouting, his voice high and tight with excitement. He was calling to the dogs, urging them forward, confident that he was closing the gap. Silas looked down at his leg. He reached down and tightened the bandages, feeling the sharp edges of the surveyor's compass. It was time to stop being the prey. He knew that in a few more minutes the hounds would reach the clearing near the old surveyor's grave, the very spot where Julian had forced Silas to dig a hole 6 months ago. Julian Thorne thought he was the master of this land. He thought he owned the trees, the water, and the people who walked on them. But the swamp doesn't care about deeds or family names. The swamp only knows the weight of a man. Julian was heavy with arrogance, heavy with his fine leather boots and his silver-mounted rifle. Silas, despite the years of abuse, was light. He knew where to step. He knew which logs would hold his weight and which ones would roll and trap a man's leg beneath the black water. As the dogs got closer, their barking turning into frantic yelps of anticipation, Silas did something he hadn't done in years. He stood up straight. He took a breath of the damp, heavy air and felt the strength in his broken leg. The bone had healed long ago, but Silas had kept the limp because a man who is pitied is rarely feared, and a man who is not feared can see everything. He saw Julian Thorne coming through the trees, his face flushed with the thrill of the kill. Julian was so focused on the dragging trail in the mud that he didn't look up. He didn't see the way the ground ahead of him began to shimmer with a strange, oily light. He didn't see that the trail Silas had left was leading him away from the firm ground and directly towards the heart of the quicksand. The trap was set, the bait was moving, and the hunter was seconds away from realizing that he was the one being led to the slaughter. Silas moved behind a massive moss-covered oak and waited. He didn't have a gun, he didn't have a knife, he didn't need them. He had the truth in his bandages and the swamp beneath his feet. And as the first hound broke into the clearing, Silas prepared to show Julian Thorne exactly what happens when you try to hunt a man who has nothing left to lose but his silence. Julian Thorne was a man who believed in the weight of his own name. He believed that money could wash blood off any floor, and that a title made him a god over the dirt he walked on. But what he didn't realize is that blood doesn't just wash away, it soaks into the earth, and the earth has a way of holding on to a grudge. Silas was part of that earth. He had been stomped on, broken, and pushed aside for 20 years.
But the more you compress dirt, the harder it gets. Now Silas was harder than anything Julian Thorne had ever encountered, and he was leading the plantation's golden boy into a place where a family name meant less than a dry piece of wood. The black slow was breathing. That's how Silas always thought of it, the way the bubbles rose from the dark water, the way the cypress knees seemed to shift in the corner of your eye. It was a place of shadows and damp heat. Silas moved through it with a grace that would have shocked Julian Thorne. The limp was gone. Every step was precise. He knew where the roots were strong enough to hold a man and where the mud was a hungry mouth waiting to swallow anything that put too much weight on it. Behind him, the dogs were getting louder. The sound was a jagged edge cutting through the heavy silence of the swamp. King, the lead hound, was a beast of muscle and scars. He was Julian's favorite because he didn't just hunt, he enjoyed the terror of the prey. Silas could hear the wet, rhythmic slapping of the dog's paws hitting the shallow water. It was a countdown, but Silas wasn't just running, he was working. Every few yards he would stop and drag his left foot, creating that familiar uneven trail. He wanted Julian to see it. He wanted Julian to feel that surge of arrogant confidence, thinking his prey was tiring, thinking the pendulum was finally slowing down. Silas reached a thicket of sawgrass and reached into a small pouch he had hidden under his shirt. Inside was a piece of salted pork he had taken from the kitchen days ago. It was wrapped in a rag soaked in turpentine and old grease. He didn't throw it far. He placed it carefully on a high root, well away from the path he was actually taking. The scent of the turpentine was sharp, a chemical bite in the air that would scramble a dog's nose for just a few vital seconds. The first shot rang out, and it was closer than Silas expected. The bullet tore through a palm frond a foot above his head, showering him in green shards. Julian was close. He was screaming now, his voice cracking with a mixture of excitement and frustration. He was cursing the mud, cursing the trees, and cursing Silas. He shouted that he was going to make Silas crawl all the way back to the plantation on his hands and knees. He shouted that he was going to hang the brass compass, the one he thought was long gone, around Silas's neck before he finished him. That was the moment Silas stopped. He didn't turn around, but he felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the swamp water. Julian mentioned the compass. Did he suspect, or was he just raving? Silas touched the hard, round shape through his bandages. It was still there. The metal was warm against his skin, a silent witness to a murder that Julian thought he had buried. Julian's horse was the first thing to fail. The animal was a thoroughbred, built for speed on flat land, not for the treacherous shifting floor of a Louisiana swamp. Silas heard the horse scream, a high, terrifying sound that echoed through the trees. He heard the heavy splash and Julian's muffled grunt as he was thrown into the muck. The horse had found one of the false floors, a patch of floating moss that looked like solid ground, but was actually a deep pool of stagnant water. The animal struggled, its eyes rolling back, until it finally managed to scramble back toward the drier ground, ridless and terrified.
Julian was on foot now. His expensive leather boots, the ones he boasted cost more than a man's life, were filled with black sludge. This was the turning point. A man like Julian Thorne is only powerful when he has his tools, his horse, his dogs, his guns. Strip those away, and he's just a frightened boy in a very large, very dark room. But Julian still had his rifle, and he still had his pride. He pulled himself out of the mud, his face smeared with grease and sweat. He saw the Limp trail again, leading deeper into the black slough. He didn't see Silas watching him from behind a massive moss-draped cypress. He didn't see the way Silas stood perfectly still, his breathing shallow and controlled. The hounds reached the turpentine-soaked rag. King skidded to a halt, his powerful nose twitching. The chemical smell was an assault on the dog's senses. He began to whimper, turning in circles, his tail tucked between his legs. The other dogs followed suit, their focused pursuit dissolving into confusion. Julian caught up to him, gasping for air, his lungs burning in the humid heat. He saw the dogs losing the scent and lost his mind. He began to kick at them, screaming for them to find the track. He was a man who couldn't handle the idea that something wasn't going his way. He raised his rifle and fired another shot, this one hitting the water near King's paws. The dog yelped and bolted into the brush, disappearing into the thicket. Silas watched it all. He felt a strange sense of pity, not for Julian, but for the dogs. They were just tools, trained to be cruel by a master who didn't know the meaning of the word mercy. But pity was a luxury Silas couldn't afford. He looked at the sun, which was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks across the water. The tide was moving. The swamp was about to change. The water levels in the black slough could rise 2 feet in an hour when the tide pushed up through the bayou. Silas knew exactly where the high ground was. Julian didn't. "I see you, Silas!" Julian screamed, his voice shaking. He didn't see him, but he was guessing. He started moving toward the old surveyor's gravesite. He was walking right toward the center of the slough, where the ground was nothing but a thin crust over a deep, airless mire. Every step Julian took was heavier than the last. His breathing was a ragged sob. He was tired, he was wet, and he was starting to realize that the man he was hunting wasn't acting like a man who was afraid. Silas stepped out from behind the tree. He didn't hide anymore. He stood on a firm ridge of roots looking down at Julian Thorne. The two men were only 20 yards apart, but in the swamp, that might as well have been 20 miles. Julian froze. He raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking so hard the barrel was dancing. He saw Silas standing tall. He saw the leg that was supposed to be shattered. He saw the calm in Silas's eyes, and for the first time in his life, Julian Thorne felt the cold hand of true terror. "You been faking it, you," Julian hissed, his teeth chattering despite the heat. "You been mocking me for years." Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. He reached down and slowly began to unwrap the thick, muddy bandages from his left leg. The cloth fell away in heavy, wet strips. Julian watched, mesmerized by the slow movement. When the last layer came off, Silas held up something. The sun caught the polished brass, making it flare like a small star in the gloom. It was the surveyor's compass. The initials USLO were clearly visible, even from 20 yards away. The color drained from Julian's face. He knew what that compass meant. It wasn't just a tool. It was a death warrant. It was the proof that the man Julian had killed wasn't just a trespasser, but a federal official. It was the proof that the Thorne land was built on a foundation of lies and murder. Julian tried to step forward to grab the compass, but his foot didn't find the bottom. He sank to his waist in a single sickening motion. The mud gripped him like a cold vice. He tried to pull himself out, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank. The rifle slipped from his hands and vanished into the black water with a dull plop. "The mud doesn't care about your family name, Julian," Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried over the water like a bell. It was the first time he had spoken Julian's name without a mister in front of it. It was the sound of a man who had finally found his own voice. Julian was waist-deep now. He was clawing at the air, his fingers scratching against the slick bark of a nearby root that was just out of reach. He started to plead. He offered Silas money. He offered him his freedom. He offered the entire plantation. Silas just stood there, watching the tide begin to swirl around Julian's chest. He knew that Toby, the stable boy, had already slipped away to find Sheriff Miller. The sheriff was already on his way to the edge of the swamp, led by the sound of Julian's rifle shots. But the sheriff wouldn't get here in time to save Julian's pride, and Julian was starting to realize that the man he had called broken was the only thing standing between him and the dark water. The question wasn't whether Julian would survive the swamp. The question was what would be left of the Thorn name once the sun finally set on the Black Slough. Silas looked at the compass, then back at the sinking man. The hunt was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. And as the first stars began to peek through the cypress branches, the silence of the swamp returned, heavier and more honest than any lie a Thorn had ever told. Julian Thorn was a man who never knew the meaning of the word stay. He was used to the world moving out of his way. He was used to the earth bowing under his boots. But the Black Slough didn't care about the Thorn bloodline or the thousands of acres Julian claimed to own. The mud here was ancient, thick as molasses and twice as sticky, and it was currently claiming Julian, inch by agonizing inch. He was waist-deep now, and the more he struggled, the more the myrrh sang its wet, sucking song. He looked up at Silas, who stood on a thick cypress root like a judge on a bench, and for the first time in his life, Julian saw a man instead of a shadow. He saw the strength in Silas's shoulders and the cold, hard clarity in Silas's eyes. What Julian didn't know was that Silas had been waiting for this exact moment for 3 years.
Has been Thornland for 3 generations. It was government land, Silas countered, his voice sharpening. It was land for the people, and you stole it. You burned the deeds, and you killed the man who came to count the truth. You thought the fire took everything, but the fire didn't want this compass, Julian, and neither does the mud. The water was rising. The tide was pushing its way through the narrow channels of the bayou, and the level in the Black Slough was creeping up toward Julian's chest. The mosquitoes were swarming now, sensing the blood and the sweat of a trapped animal. Julian was slapping at his face, his movements frantic and useless. He was losing his grip on the cypress root he had been trying to reach. His fingers were raw and bleeding, the bark tearing under his fingernails. He looked toward the edge of the clearing, hoping to see his father's men or the rest of the hounds, but there was nothing but the shifting shadows of the trees. What Julian didn't realize was that Toby, the stable boy, wasn't just bringing the sheriff, he was bringing the evidence. Before the hunt began, Hattie had slipped a folded piece of paper into Toby's pocket. It was a partial map that the surveyor had managed to shove into his boot before Julian dragged him into the woods. A map Silas had retrieved while Julian was busy washing his hands in the creek. Hattie had hidden it in the flour bin for months, waiting for the right moment. The Thorn plantation wasn't just a house, it was a cage of secrets, and the bars were finally starting to rust. The sound of horses began to filter through the trees. It was distant at first, a faint rhythmic thudding that Julian mistook for his own heartbeat. He perked up, a spark of hope lighting his eyes. He started to scream, a high-pitched, desperate wail that echoed off the cypress trunks. He shouted that he was being robbed. He shouted that Silas had lured him into the swamp to murder him. He was already building the lie, already weaving the story that would save his neck and put Silas on a gallows. He looked at Silas with a triumphant sneer, even as the water reached his armpits. "You hear that, Silas?" Julian hissed. "That's the law, and they don't listen to men like you. They listen to men like me. You're dead. You're a dead man walking." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't run. He just stood there, watching the water swirl around the man who had tried to break him.
He knew Sheriff Miller. The sheriff was a man who had grown up in the shadow of the Thorne family, and he was tired of the darkness. He was a man who needed a reason to do the right thing, and Silas was about to give him a reason he couldn't ignore. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the original land deed, the one he had snatched from the edge of Julian's fire. It was scorched around the edges, the paper brittle and yellowed, but the seals were still intact. It was the physical proof of the theft, the paper trail that led straight back to Julian's study. The horses were closer now. Silas could hear the jingling of the bridles and the voices of men calling out to one another. He saw the flicker of lanterns through the dense foliage. The sun was gone, and the swamp was falling into a deep indigo darkness. Julian was almost completely submerged now. He was tilting his head back, trying to keep his nose above the rising tide. The mud was holding him tight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that wouldn't let go. He was no longer screaming. He was gasping, his eyes wide with the realization that the law might arrive just in time to watch him disappear. "Help me," Julian whispered, the arrogance finally stripped away. "Please, Silas, I don't want to die in the dark." Silas looked down at him. He thought about the 3 years of mocking laughter. He thought about the iron bar and the sound of his own bones snapping. He thought about the surveyor's daughters, waiting for a father who would never come home. Justice isn't always about a courtroom. Sometimes it's about standing still while the world rights itself. Silas didn't move to help him, but he didn't leave either. He stayed to ensure the truth was delivered. Suddenly, the brush at the edge of the clearing exploded. Sheriff Miller burst through, followed by 2 deputies and a trembling Toby. The lanterns they carried cut through the gloom, their light reflecting off the stagnant water and the brass compass in Silas's hand. The sheriff stopped dead, his eyes darting from Silas, who was standing straight and tall, to the top of Julian's head poking out of the mud. "What in the name of God is going on here?" the sheriff demanded, his hand hovering over his holster. Julian tried to speak, but he only managed a wet, gurgling sound. He pointed a muddy hand at Silas, his eyes pleading. One of the deputies moved toward the water, but Silas stepped forward, blocking the path. He didn't use force, he just held up the compass and the scorched deed. The light of the lanterns hit the surveyor's initials on the compass lid, and the sheriff froze. He knew that compass. He had seen it on the belt of the federal man who had visited his office 6 months earlier. He had wondered what happened to that man. He had wondered why Julian Thorne had been so quick to claim the man had simply moved on to the next parish. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice cutting through the panic, "you're looking for a murderer, and you're looking for a thief. The murderer is in the mud. The proof is in my hand." The sheriff looked at the deed, then at the compass. He looked at Toby, who was nodding frantically, his eyes wide with fear and relief. The sheriff was a man of the law, but he was also a man who knew the smell of a lie. He looked at Julian Thorne, the golden boy of the parish, sinking into the very land he killed to own. The silence returned to the clearing, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a hammer falling. The weight of the Thorne name was no longer enough to keep Julian afloat. For as the deputies began to uncoil their ropes, not out of mercy, but to secure a prisoner for the hangman, Silas felt the weight in his own chest finally begin to lift. But the night wasn't over yet. There were still things hidden in the black slough that Julian Thorne would do anything to keep buried, and the sheriff was about to find out just how deep the rot went. Silas watched the ropes fly through the air, knowing that Julian might be pulled from the mud. He would never be a free man again. The reckoning had arrived, and it was colder and more final than any hunt Julian ever imagined. Julian Thorne thought the mud was his only enemy. He thought that if he could just get his feet back on solid ground, the father's money and the Thorne name would wash away the filth of the black slough. but as the heavy hemp rope tightened around his chest, Julian realized
something that turned his blood colder than the swamp water. The sheriff wasn't pulling him back to the plantation house to sit by a warm fire. He was pulling him into a cage. The rope wasn't a lifeline, it was a leash, and at the other end of that leash wasn't a friend, but a lawman who had finally seen the rot behind the Thorne family's golden curtain. Julian was pulled from the mire with a sickening wet sound, like a cork being drawn from a bottle of sour wine. He collapsed on the root-choked bank, gasping and shivering, a pathetic heap of mud and ruined silk. He looked up, expecting to see Silas cowering, but instead he saw Silas standing tall, his back straight for the first time in 3 years. The pendulum had stopped swinging, and the clock had finally run out for the Thorne dynasty. Sheriff Miller didn't offer Julian a hand to help him up. He stood over him, the lantern light carving deep, hard lines into his face. He held the brass compass Silas had provided, turning it over in his calloused fingers. The initials of the United States Land Office were a silent, damning testimony. The sheriff looked at the scorched deed, then at the mud-caked man at his feet. He knew that if he let Julian walk away tonight, the evidence would disappear by morning. Money has a way of making papers vanish and witnesses go silent. But Miller was tired of the Thorne family shadow over his parish. He looked at Silas and gave a single sharp nod. It was a silent command. Silas walked over to a specific patch of ground just a few feet from where Julian had been sinking. He didn't say a word. He simply pointed his toe at a slight depression in the earth, marked by a single withered cypress knee. "Start digging," the sheriff told his deputies. Julian tried to scramble to his feet, his voice a frantic, high-pitched screech. He told them they had no right. He told them he would have their badges. He shouted that Silas was a thief who had planted evidence. But the deputies didn't listen. They used their hands and the butts of their rifles to clear the top layer of muck. It didn't take long. The swamp ground is soft, and Julian had been in a hurry when he buried his secret 6 months ago. The first thing they found was a leather boot, the stitching still holding together despite the rot. Then came the brass buttons of a federal uniform, and finally the shattered skull of a man who had only wanted to do his job. The clearing went deathly silent. Even the insects seemed to stop their buzzing. The truth was out of the ground now, and it had a physical weight that Julian Thorne couldn't ignore. The sheriff turned to Julian, his hand resting on the iron shackles at his belt. The transition from master to prisoner was instantaneous. One moment, Julian was the heir to thousands of acres. The next, he was just another killer caught in the act. The click of the iron around Julian's wrists was the loudest sound in the swamp. It was a final, definitive sound. Julian stopped screaming. He stopped threatening. He just stared at the bones in the dirt, his face pale and vacant. He realized that the hunt was over, and he was the trophy. Silas stood back, watching the deputies haul Julian toward the horses. He didn't feel a surge of joy. He didn't laugh. He just felt a deep, quiet sense of completion. He had carried the surveyor's compass in his bandages for months, feeling its cold weight against his skin every hour of every day. Now the weight was gone, but the reckoning wasn't limited to the swamp. As the sun began to rise, the news of Julian's arrest spread through the Thorne plantation like wildfire. Hattie was waiting at the edge of the fields, her arms crossed over her apron, watching the sheriff's party emerge from the tree line. She saw Julian covered in black mud and bound in irons, being led behind a horse like a common thief. She didn't say a word, but she caught Silas's eye and gave him the smallest of smiles. It was enough. The other laborers stood in silence, watching the man who had mocked their pain being led away in shame. The power of the Thorne name had evaporated the moment the first bone was pulled from the mud.
Within a week, federal agents arrived from New Orleans. They didn't care about local politics or the Thorne family's history. They only cared about the murder of a government official and the theft of federal land. They went through Julian's study with a fine-tooth comb. They found the maps that Julian hadn't quite managed to burn. The entire estate was placed under federal lien. The thousands of acres Julian had killed for were seized by the government. The Thorne house, with its wide porches and polished floors, was boarded up, its windows staring out like the eyes of a dead man. Julian Thorne was taken to a federal prison far away from the parish, where his name meant something. He would spend the rest of his life in a stone cell, with nothing to listen to but the sound of his own breathing and the memory of the pendulum swinging in the dust. Silas didn't stay to watch the final collapse of the Thorne estate. He had done what he came to do. The federal government, grateful for his role as the key witness and for the recovery of the surveyor's tools, granted him a reward. It wasn't just money, it was a relocation and a new identity. They offered him a chance to leave the bayou behind forever. On his last day at the plantation, Silas walked to the edge of the Black Slough one final time. He looked at the water, now calm and still under the morning sun. He didn't limp. He walked with a steady, even gait that felt strange and new. He realized that for 3 years he had been playing a part, and the part had become so familiar it felt like a second skin. But the skin was shed now. He left Louisiana on a humid Tuesday morning. He didn't take much, just a small bag of clothes and the knowledge that the man who had broken his leg would never hurt anyone again. As the wagon pulled away from the plantation gates, Silas didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that the swamp would eventually reclaim the Thorne house. The vines would choke the pillars, and the mud would swallow the foundations. The earth always wins in the end. A man who thinks he is the hunter often forgets to look at the tracks he is following. Arrogance is a heavy weight in deep water, and Julian Thorne had been sinking long before he ever stepped into the Black Slough. The brass compass stayed with the sheriff as evidence, but the lesson it taught stayed with the people of the parish. They learned that a man's worth isn't measured by the land he owns, but by the truth he carries. Silas was the smallest man on the Thorne estate, the one they mocked and ignored, but he was the one who held the power to bring the whole house down. He was the one who understood that justice doesn't always come with a shout. Sometimes it comes with a slow, patient limp and a secret hidden in a bandage. The story of Silas and Julian Thorne became a legend in the bayou, a warning to those who think they can bury their sins in the dark, because the mud has a long memory and it always gives up its dead. If this story of calculated justice and the fall of a tyrant touched you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more accounts of the hidden history of the South. Share this video with someone who values the truth over power, and tell us in the comments where are you watching from. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. Until next time, remember that the ground beneath your feet might be holding more than just dirt.